Welcome back to Midnight Affair Tales. Thank you for joining us. Dylan Hayes had always trusted his instincts. It was what made him a great FBI agent. His ability to sense when something wasn't right before the evidence ever surfaced. But tonight, it wasn't a criminal case triggering that deep, unsettling feeling in his gut. It was his wife. Claire had always been a loving wife, or so he thought. But over the past few months, something had changed. She had become distant. Her laughter, once effortless, now felt forced. Her touch had turned cold. And the worst part? The phone calls. Tonight was no different. Dylan lay in bed, exhausted from a long day at the bureau, but his mind refused to shut down. Claire had excused herself to the bathroom with her phone, just like she had been doing every night lately. He glanced at the clock, 12:47 a.m. The silence of their dimly lit bedroom was suddenly broken by a faint ding, a text notification. It wasn't unusual except for the way Claire's breath hitched when she saw it. She wasn't expecting him to still be awake. Dylan watched her out of the corner of his eye as she quickly grabbed her phone, shielding the screen as she typed a response. A second later, she turned her back to him and headed toward the bathroom, locking the door behind her. His chest tightened. He had spent years interrogating criminals, spotting deception in their eyes, dissecting their body language. And right now, his own wife was radiating pure guilt. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he slipped out of bed, walking silently toward the bathroom door. He pressed his ear against it. A whisper. Not just any whisper, a soft, intimate whisper. And then a name he didn't recognize. Dylan's stomach dropped. His blood turned ice cold. His hands clenched into fists as the truth he had refused to acknowledge began to set in. His wife was hiding something. And now he needed to find out exactly what. But was he ready for the truth? Dylan wasn't the kind of man to let emotions cloud his judgment. He had solved high-profile cases, taken down men twice his size, and outsmarted criminals who thought they were untouchable. But now, in the silence of his own home, he felt like the fool. Claire emerged from the bathroom minutes later, acting as if nothing had happened. She smiled at him, soft, innocent, rehearsed. "Can't sleep?" she asked, sliding into bed beside him. Dylan forced a smile, his mind already working at 100 miles per hour. "Just thinking about work," he said casually. He had to be smart about this. If Claire was lying to him, if she was cheating, she had already perfected her routine. He wouldn't get answers by confronting her, not yet. Instead, he needed evidence. The next morning, while Claire was in the shower, Dylan grabbed her phone from the nightstand. He knew her passcode, his birthday. Ironic. But the moment he opened her texts, he found nothing. The messages were deleted. That was the first real sign that she was hiding something. A woman with nothing to hide wouldn't erase her messages. Dylan put her phone back just as he heard the water shut off. His pulse was racing, but his face remained neutral. He wouldn't let her see the storm brewing inside him. That afternoon, he did something he never thought he'd do in his own marriage. He tailed her. He had done it 1,000 times in his career, following suspects, tracking criminals. But following his own wife felt like betrayal. Yet she had already betrayed him first. He parked a few cars away from her at the cafe she said she was meeting Mia at. But Mia never showed. Instead, a man did. A well-dressed, cocky-looking man who pulled out a chair beside Claire, touched her hand and leaned in close. Claire laughed. The kind of laugh she used to give Dylan. Dylan's grip on the steering wheel tightened. His entire world was about to change. Dylan sat in his car watching his wife betray him in real time. He had imagined a lot of things in his life, but never this. Claire smiled at the man across from her, her eyes glowing in a way Dylan hadn't seen in months. She played with the edge of her coffee cup, her fingers brushing against the man's wrist as they whispered back and forth. Dylan's FBI-trained instincts kicked in. This wasn't just some fling. This was something deeper. Something dangerous. He reached for his phone and snapped a few pictures. Evidence. Not that he needed it, the truth was staring right at him. The man finally got up, tossing some cash on the table. He leaned down, whispering something in Claire's ear. She nodded. Then they left. Dylan followed, his pulse hammering against his ribs. Claire didn't go home. She didn't go back to work. She followed the man into a black luxury car, one Dylan instantly recognized. Tommy Hale. Dylan's breath hitched. This wasn't just any affair. Tommy Hale was dangerous. A man Dylan's department had been trying to take down for years. What the hell had Claire gotten herself into? The car pulled away and Dylan, careful not to be seen, started his own engine. He had followed criminals before, but this was different. This wasn't just about justice. This was personal. And for the first time in his life, Dylan didn't care about playing by the rules. He was going to make them both pay. Dylan had spent years chasing criminals, but this was different. This wasn't just about justice, it was about betrayal. Claire wasn't just cheating, she was tangled up with a man whose name was whispered in the halls of the FBI with caution. Tommy Hale. A real estate mogul on paper, but beneath that polished image was a man knee-deep in money laundering, illegal arms deals, and cartel connections. The FBI had been circling him for years, but he was always one step ahead. Now Dylan's own wife was in his orbit. He gripped the steering wheel, following at a distance as Tommy's black car weaved through the streets, finally pulling into an underground parking garage of a high-end hotel. Claire stepped out first, glancing around before slipping inside. Dylan's jaw clenched. She was being careful. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but she did it anyway. Dylan's fingers hovered over his phone. He could call it in, bring in the bureau, get Tommy locked up right now. But he didn't. This wasn't about the case. This was personal. Instead, he parked down the street, stepped out, and blended into the shadows. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He moved quickly, finding an access point to the hotel's security system. One override and he was in. The cameras fed directly to his phone. He scrolled through the floors searching, until he found them. Penthouse suite. Claire was already inside, standing close to Tommy. He poured her a drink. She smiled. Then Tommy leaned in and kissed her. Dylan's world shattered. His grip on his phone was so tight, his knuckles turned white. His stomach churned with fury, betrayal, and something even darker. He could storm in. And this now. But no, that was too easy. They needed to suffer. And Dylan was about to make sure they did. Dylan sat in his darkened car, watching the hotel like a hunter waiting for his prey. He wasn't a man who let emotions cloud his actions, but tonight? Tonight was different. Claire had lied straight to his face. She had kissed another man. And not just any man, a criminal. But Dylan wasn't just any husband. He was FBI. And the thing about FBI agents? They always catch their targets. He unlocked his phone and scrolled to an anonymous number. He typed a single message and hit send. How long do you think you can keep your dirty little secret? Inside the hotel, Claire's phone lit up. Dylan watched from the security camera as she froze. She looked at Tommy, then around the room like a trapped animal. Good. She should be scared. Because this was only the beginning. As he watched her unravel, Dylan's focus shifted. He needed to play this smart. He wasn't just going to destroy their affair, he was going to break them both. But first he needed something from you. Yes, you. The one reading this. You've been with me on this journey, watching everything unfold. But I want to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. Let's see where my story has reached. And if you think Dylan's revenge should be brutal, if you think Claire and Tommy deserve what's coming, hit that like button. Because trust me, the best part is still coming. Now let's hit 2,000 subscribers, together. The next morning, Dylan played the role of the perfect husband. He sat at the kitchen table, reading the paper, sipping his coffee, while Claire moved around the kitchen like nothing was wrong. But Dylan saw the way she kept checking her phone. The way her fingers trembled slightly when she poured her coffee. She was rattled. Late night? He asked casually. Claire flinched but recovered quickly. Mia and I had a lot to catch up on. Mia. She was still using that excuse. Dylan smiled, nodding as if he believed her. That's nice. You should invite her over sometime. Claire hesitated. Then laughed nervously. Yeah. Maybe. Dylan took another sip of his coffee, letting silence stretch between them. Then with a knowing look he said, By the way, you got a text last night. You looked a little surprised. Claire froze. Just for a second. Just long enough for Dylan to see the fear flash in her eyes. But then she forced a smile. Oh, probably just Mia. Lies. So many lies. Dylan leaned back in his chair, watching her squirm. She was unraveling little by little. But this was just the beginning. Because Dylan wasn't just going to catch them. He was going to destroy them. And neither Claire nor Tommy had any idea what was coming. Dylan had spent his entire career tracking criminals, reading their behaviors, anticipating their next moves. But now he was tracking his own wife. And she was making it too easy. After breakfast, Claire rushed out of the house, claiming she had last-minute errands to run. Dylan already knew where she was going. The moment she was out of sight, he was on the move, following her at a distance. She drove straight across town, past her usual shopping spots, ignoring her favorite cafe. Instead, she pulled into a sleek underground parking lot. Dylan followed, keeping his distance as she slipped into the elevator and pressed the penthouse button. Tommy Hale's penthouse. Dylan's jaw clenched. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. He pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolling to a secure app the FBI used for surveillance. It took seconds to hack into the hotel's security feed. A live camera feed from the hallway outside Tommy's penthouse flickered to life. And there she was. Claire stepped out of the elevator, her body language tense but eager. Tommy opened the door, dressed in a crisp suit, his signature smirk stretching across his face. He pulled her inside and the door shut behind them. Dylan's grip on his phone tightened. His wife had just walked into a lion's den. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay in control. Rage would only get him so far. He needed evidence. A plan. A way to dismantle them both. His fingers hovered over his phone as he typed out a message. You think secrets stay buried? Think again. He hit send. Inside the penthouse, Claire's phone buzzed. Dylan watched as she pulled it from her bag, her face draining of color. She showed the message to Tommy, her hands shaking. Tommy snatched the phone from her, reading it with narrowed eyes. Then he did something that made Dylan's stomach drop. He laughed. Dylan frowned, leaning forward. Tommy wasn't afraid. If anything, he looked amused. The realization hit Dylan like a freight train. Tommy knew. He knew someone was watching. And worse, he wasn't afraid. Dylan knew when a criminal was bluffing. Tommy wasn't bluffing. Something about that laugh unnerved him. He had expected Claire to panic, maybe even run back home, terrified that someone was on to her. But Tommy? He was too calm. Dylan tapped into the penthouse audio feed, adjusting the volume. Always watching, Claire was saying, her voice hushed with fear. What if it's him? Him. She meant Dylan. His wife was terrified of him finding out. Good. Tommy exhaled, unbothered. Relax, babe. If it is him, we handle it. Handle it? Dylan's blood ran cold. This wasn't just an affair. This was something bigger. Tommy wasn't just some side piece, he had a plan. Dylan leaned back in his car seat, his mind racing. He could end this right now. Call in a raid. Arrest Tommy. But that would be too easy. Claire needed to suffer. Tommy needed to lose everything. And Dylan? He needed to watch them both crumble. So he let them believe they were safe. For now. Dylan had been patient. But now it was time to make his move. The next morning he walked into the FBI headquarters with a plan. His partner, Riley Carter, was already waiting in their shared office, sipping his usual black coffee. Riley had been his partner for 5 years. Trusted. Sure. And most importantly, he hated Tommy Hale. Morning, Riley said. You look like you've been up all night. Dylan gave a tight smile. Something's been keeping me up. He pulled out a USB drive and slid it across the desk. Riley picked it up, frowning. What's this? Proof, Dylan said, his voice steady. Tommy Hale has been running a side operation. Money laundering. Illegal assets. It's all in there. Riley raised an eyebrow. And where did you get this? Dylan held his gaze. Does it matter? Riley smirked. Not if it puts him away. And just like that, Tommy Hale's empire was about to collapse. Within hours, the FBI had issued a search warrant. A team was already en route to one of Tommy's storage units, ready to tear his operation apart. Dylan sat at his desk, waiting. Then the call came in. Sir, we found something, an agent reported. But, there's a problem. Dylan's grip on the phone tightened. What kind of problem? Pause. Looks like someone tipped him off. The place is clean. Dylan's pulse spiked. Someone had warned Tommy. And there was only one person who could have done that. Claire. Dylan paced his office, his mind racing. Claire warned him. She knew. She knew the FBI was coming, and instead of letting Tommy face the consequences, she tipped him off. His own wife had betrayed him again. He clenched his fists, staring at the dark city skyline through his window. Claire wasn't just cheating, she was working against him. And that changed everything. A soft knock on his office door snapped him back to reality. Riley stepped in, his expression tight. Bad news. Dylan already knew. Tommy's gone. Riley nodded. Vanished. Our guys are still combing through his records, but if he was warned. Dylan exhaled slowly. He'll lay low for a while. Maybe. Riley hesitated, eyeing him. But something about this feels personal. You sure you're good? Dylan forced a smirk. Never better. Was. He wasn't good. He was furious. But he wouldn't let that show. Not yet. That night, Dylan sat on the couch, sipping whiskey, watching Claire move around their home like nothing had happened. She hummed softly in the kitchen, pretending to be the perfect wife. But he saw through it. She had chosen Tommy. And now, she was about to find out what it felt like to lose everything. Long day? She asked, pouring herself a glass of wine. Dylan glanced at her, the anger boiling just beneath the surface. Yeah. Someone tipped off a suspect before we could take him down. Claire froze for half a second. It was subtle. Barely there. But Dylan saw it. She knew exactly who he was talking about. That's awful, she said, her voice careful. Any leads? Dylan let a small, knowing smile touch his lips. Not yet. But I always find my targets. She looked away. Good. Let her sweat. Dylan needed more than just his instincts, he needed proof. He left work early the next day, heading straight to a place he never thought he'd need. A private investigator. Ethan Ross was a former detective, the kind of guy who got answers no matter what. If anyone could dig up more dirt, it was him. Dylan slid a thick folder across the table as they sat in Ethan's dimly lit office. What's this? Ethan asked, flipping it open. My wife, Dylan said coldly. And the man she's been screwing behind my back. Ethan whistled low. Damn. That's rough. I need everything on them, Dylan continued. Calls, texts, movements. Whatever you find, I want it. Ethan leaned back, studying him. This isn't just about the affair, is it? Dylan didn't answer. Because it wasn't. It was about revenge. Ethan nodded as if understanding. All right. I'll find what you need. And just like that, the noose around Claire and Tommy's necks began to tighten. Dylan was a man of patience. A strategist. A hunter. But the waiting was beginning to gnaw at him. Claire still played the role of the perfect wife, smiling, laughing, acting as if she wasn't sneaking off to see Tommy behind his back. Acting as if she hadn't just destroyed the biggest FBI case in years by warning that scumbag to run. And Dylan? He let her think she was safe. That was the fun part. But the walls were closing in. And soon she wouldn't even see it coming. Ethan Ross had worked fast. The private investigator had sent over a full 24-hour surveillance report within 2 days, and it was all neatly organized on Dylan's laptop. He sat in his home office, scrolling through photos, text logs, even audio snippets of Claire's conversations. Every page fueled the fire in his chest. Claire, texting Tommy, I don't think we should meet for a while. It's too risky. Tommy, relax. I got people handling it. Claire, people? What does that mean? Tommy, it means if anyone tries to dig, they'll regret it. Dylan stared at those words for a long time. Tommy had people. And that meant Claire wasn't just cheating with a criminal. She was protecting one. Dylan clicked on one of the audio files labeled, Hotel Claire and Tommy, Penthouse Meeting 10:42 p.m. He adjusted his earpiece and pressed play. Claire's voice came through first, nervous, whispering. Dylan's acting weird. I think he's on to me. Pause. Then Tommy's deep, smooth voice. So what? He's an FBI agent, not a goddamn psychic. Claire let out a shaky breath. No, Tommy. He's dangerous. If he finds out everything, I don't know what he'll do. Dylan inhaled slowly, gripping the arms of his chair. He knew exactly what he would do. Dylan stared at the laptop screen, his mind a mix of cold calculation and raw fury. Claire feared what he would do if he found out everything? Good. Because now he was about to make sure she lived that fear. He closed his laptop, exhaling slowly. It was time to set the trap. The next morning, Claire acted like nothing was wrong. She kissed Dylan on the cheek before heading out, claiming she was meeting her friend Mia. Mia, the ever-convenient excuse. Dylan let her go. And then he got to work. First, he sent an anonymous email to the FBI cybercrime unit. Attached was a forged transaction record showing large, untraceable payments funneled through one of Tommy Hale's shell companies. The recipient? Claire Hayes. It was all fabricated, of course. But the FBI didn't know that. By the time Claire returned home that night, looking relaxed and unsuspecting, Dylan was already in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of bourbon. She smiled at him. "Hey, babe." He lifted his glass in greeting. "Hey." She went to the fridge, grabbing a bottle of wine. "You're home early." Dylan took a slow sip. "Yeah. Big day at the bureau." Claire stiffened just for a second. Then, as if nothing had happened, she turned to face him. "Oh? Anything interesting?" Dylan leaned against the counter, tilting his head. "Well, yeah. Someone leaked bank records linking you to Tommy Hale's businesses." Claire went completely still. Her fingers tightened around the wine bottle. She swallowed, forcing a small laugh. What? Dylan just watched her. Silent. Calculating. Enjoying this. "You heard me," he murmured. "The FBI is looking into it. Apparently your name is on the list of suspicious accounts." Claire's breathing turned shallow. She tried to laugh it off, but Dylan saw the sheer panic in her eyes. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. Dylan just kept watching. Waiting. Letting her spiral. Because this was only the beginning. Claire barely slept that night. Dylan knew because he stayed awake, listening to her toss and turn. She was cracking. Good. By morning she was pale and distracted, barely touching her coffee. Dylan leaned back in his chair, watching her fidget with her phone. She was probably waiting for a text from Tommy. Dylan smirked to himself. She wouldn't get one. Not after what he had done last night. Because while Claire was spiraling in fear, Dylan had been busy turning Tommy against her. He had used a burner phone to send Tommy a fake message from a trusted source. "Anonymous, you have a rat in your inner circle. And her name is Claire Hayes." Simple. Effective. Now Tommy would start questioning Claire. And Claire? She'd feel the walls closing in from both sides. The moment Claire left the house, Dylan followed her. She didn't go to work. She didn't go shopping. She went straight to a secluded restaurant, slipping into a private booth. Minutes later, Tommy Hale walked in. Dylan settled into a dark corner at the back of the restaurant, just close enough to listen. Claire leaned in, her voice urgent. "Something's wrong. Dylan knows something." Tommy didn't respond immediately. He just stirred his drink, his jaw tight. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a growl, he said, "I should kill him." Dylan's pulse spiked. But Claire, his wife, didn't object. She didn't scream, didn't gasp, didn't say, "No, don't hurt him." She just stayed silent. Dylan exhaled slowly, gripping the edge of the table. This wasn't just betrayal. This was war. Now it was time for you to make a choice. What do you think Dylan should do next? Should he push them further into paranoia? Should he set them up for the ultimate fall? Tell me in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from. Because trust me, the best part is still coming. Dylan sat in his darkened car, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He had just heard his wife say nothing when Tommy suggested killing him. That silence spoke louder than words. Claire wasn't just a cheating wife. She was a traitor. He had given her his name, his love, his protection, and in return, she stood by while a criminal plotted his murder. Dylan inhaled deeply, forcing his pulse to steady. He couldn't react with rage. Rage was messy. Rage got men killed. No, Dylan wasn't going to lose control. He was going to take control. The restaurant meeting was winding down. Claire's expression was tense, her fingers twitching against her empty glass as she whispered, "I need you to fix this, Tommy. If Dylan finds out, everything falls apart." Tommy leaned back, smirking. "Relax, babe. We handle problems before they happen." Dylan had seen enough. He started his engine and peeled out of the parking lot. It was time to push them both into the fire. Dylan returned home before Claire, keeping everything perfectly normal. He showered, changed into casual clothes, and poured himself a whiskey. By the time Claire walked through the door, he was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a case file. She froze when she saw him. Guilt radiated off her. "Hey," she said, setting her bag down. "Long day." Dylan smiled, sipping his drink. "You could say that. Had to handle some unexpected developments." Claire's eyes flickered with unease. "Oh." Dylan leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Yeah. Seems like someone is out there, making threats against FBI agents." She went still. The color in her face drained. Dylan studied her reaction, savoring the fear in her eyes. "I mean," he continued, tilting his head, What kind of idiot thinks they can threaten a federal agent and get away with it? Claire swallowed. That sounds serious. Dylan nodded. It is. And you know what the best part is? He set his glass down, looking her dead in the eye. We always catch them. Claire shuddered. She turned quickly, fumbling with her bag, her hands shaking. I need to take a shower. Dylan watched her disappear into the bathroom. She was cracking. And this was only the beginning. That night, Dylan laid in bed, staring at the ceiling. Claire was beside him, curled on her side, her body rigid with tension. She wasn't sleeping. Neither was he. Dylan waited, letting the hours tick by until her breathing slowed, deepened. Until she thought he was asleep. Then, carefully, silently, he slid out of bed. Claire's phone was on the nightstand. Dylan picked it up and walked out of the bedroom, locking himself in his office. He plugged her phone into his laptop, bypassing her passcode in under 2 minutes. FBI tech training had its benefits. He went straight to her messages. There it was. The final lie. Claire, earlier that night, Tommy, I'm scared. He knows something. He's looking at me differently. Tommy, keep playing your part. Act normal. We'll handle him soon. Claire, you promise? Tommy, I always do. Dylan sat back, staring at the screen. Tommy Hale had just signed his own death sentence. And Claire? She had proven exactly who she was. Dylan had all the evidence he needed. The affair. The betrayal. The murder plot. Now it was time for his next move. A move that would end them both. Dylan sat at his desk, staring at the evidence laid out before him. Screenshots of texts. Audio recordings. Financial records. Proof of Claire and Tommy's betrayal. And most importantly, proof that they planned to eliminate him. This wasn't just an affair anymore. This was a crime. His fingers hovered over his phone. He could call the FBI right now, report everything. But where was the satisfaction in that? No. He wanted them to feel the walls close in. He wanted them to suffer the way they made him suffer. And that started tonight. Dylan grabbed his keys and left the house without a word. Claire was in the shower, oblivious. Perfect. He drove straight to Tommy's main club, a high-end, exclusive lounge that catered to the rich, the corrupt, and the untouchable. Tommy thought he was above the law. He was about to learn otherwise. Dylan walked past the bouncers like he owned the place. Nobody stopped him. The perks of being FBI. Inside, he spotted Tommy immediately. Sitting in a VIP booth, laughing with 2 men, his business partners. Dylan strode forward, grabbing a drink off the bar. He didn't sit. He didn't hesitate. He slammed the glass onto Tommy's table. The entire booth went silent. Tommy looked up, his smirk fading. Agent Hayes, he said slowly. What a surprise. Dylan leaned in, his voice low and controlled. Deadly. I know everything, Hale. Tommy's smirk twitched. He was a good liar, but Dylan was better. He saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Dylan let the silence stretch. Then he placed his phone on the table and hit play. Claire's voice filled the space. Tommy, I'm scared. He knows something. Keep playing your part. Act normal. We'll handle him soon. Tommy's face drained of color. Dylan smirked. Checkmate. Tommy's hands clenched into fists. His 2 business partners exchanged glances, uneasy. They weren't used to seeing Tommy Hale shaken. Dylan leaned back, taking his time, watching Tommy sweat. You plan to take me out, Dylan said, swirling the drink in his hand. Now I'm giving you a choice. Tommy scoffed, masking his fear. A choice. Dylan nodded. Option 1, you disappear. Cut ties with Claire. Leave town, or I make sure every agency in this country puts you on a most wanted list. Tommy exhaled sharply, jaw tightening. And option 2, he muttered. Dylan's smirk faded. Option 2 is you don't get a choice. The tension was suffocating. Tommy swallowed. He knew Dylan wasn't bluffing. Dylan stood, straightening his jacket. Think fast, Hale. Then he turned to walk away. Tommy's voice stopped him. She'll never forgive you for this, you know? Dylan didn't even glance back. He simply said, She already lost me. And then he walked out. But before we continue, I need to ask you something. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. Let me know how far this story has traveled. And if you're hooked on this revenge, hit that like button. Share it. Subscribe. Because trust me, we're just getting started. Now let's hit 2,000 subscribers together. The best part? It's coming next. Claire Hayes had never been a woman who scared easily. She had always believed that she could charm, manipulate, or maneuver her way out of any situation. But tonight, as she sat alone in a cold, dimly lit interrogation room, that confidence was shattered. The steel table in front of her was bare except for a folder. A thick, official-looking folder marked FBI evidence. Claire swallowed hard, her hands clenched in her lap. The door creaked open and a man in a crisp black suit walked in. Special Agent Daniel Carter. A man she had only met once in passing at an FBI event. But tonight he wasn't here as a colleague's acquaintance. He was here as her interrogator. Mrs. Hayes. Carter sat down across from her, folding his hands neatly on the table. His expression was unreadable, his voice calm. "Do you know why you're here?" Claire licked her lips, forcing herself to stay composed. "There must be a mistake." Carter tilted his head. "A mistake." He flipped open the folder. Inside were bank records, emails, call logs. All linking her to Tommy Hale's money laundering operation. "I don't know what this is," Claire said quickly, shaking her head. I don't even know how my name got there." Carter didn't react. He just slid a small recorder toward her and pressed play. And then her own voice filled the room. "Tommy, I'm scared. He knows something. Keep playing your part. Act normal. We'll handle him soon." Claire's blood turned to ice. Her own words had trapped her. She stared at the recorder, her vision blurring. This couldn't be happening. Dylan did this. She clenched her fists under the table. He had set her up. "Mrs. Hayes." Carter's voice was quiet but firm. "This evidence is damning. You are looking at conspiracy charges, aiding and abetting a fugitive, and obstruction of justice." Her breathing turned shallow. This wasn't a game. This was real. And Dylan had made sure she had nowhere to run. Dylan sat at his desk, staring at his phone. The news was already spreading across FBI channels. Claire Hayes had been brought in for questioning. And Tommy? He had gone completely off the grid. Good. Let him run. Let him burn every last bridge, make enemies with the people he once trusted. It would make his downfall even sweeter. A knock on his office door made him look up. Riley Carter stepped in, arms crossed. "You really went through with it." Dylan leaned back in his chair. "I told you. I always finish what I start." Riley exhaled. "Claire's a mess. She's trying to play innocent, but she's cornered." Dylan nodded, feeling a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. "She's not innocent." Riley studied him for a moment. "You sure this isn't just personal?" Dylan's jaw clenched. "It's both." He wasn't going to pretend otherwise. This wasn't just about the law. It was about revenge. And he was just getting started. The moment Claire was released from questioning, she ran. She didn't go home. She didn't even call Dylan. She went straight to the only person she had left, Tommy. Except Tommy wasn't answering his phone. Panic clawed at her throat as she drove through the city, heart pounding. She tried again. Voicemail. "Damn it, Tommy. Pick up." She pulled into a secluded parking lot, grabbing her backup phone. The one Tommy had given her for emergencies. She dialed again. This time he answered. "Tommy," she gasped. "Where the hell are you?" There was a pause. Then his voice came through, sharp and irritated. "I told you not to call me." Claire's breath hitched. "You don't understand. The FBI, they have me on file. Dylan set me up." Silence. Then Tommy sighed. "What do you expect me to do?" Claire's stomach dropped. "What?" she whispered. "You got sloppy, Claire. I told you to be careful. Now you're dragging me down with you." Her pulse spiked. "Tommy, no. You said we'd disappear together. You promised." "Things change," he said coldly. "I need to cut my losses." Claire felt like the air had been sucked out of her lungs. He was leaving her. She destroyed her marriage for this man. Lied for him. Betrayed Dylan for him. And now he was throwing her away. She gripped the phone, shaking. "Tommy, if you do this to me, I swear." He chuckled, low and cruel. "What? You'll go to Dylan? Beg him to fix your mess?" Her silence was his answer. "Goodbye, Claire." The line went dead. Claire sat there, her hands shaking, her breath ragged. This was karma. It was coming for her. And now she had nothing left. Claire's hands trembled as she tossed the burner phone onto the passenger seat. Her entire world had collapsed in a matter of hours. Dylan knew. Tommy abandoned her. The FBI was watching. And now, she was completely alone. Her mind raced as she pulled out of the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her together. She needed a plan. Fast. Dylan was always 10 steps ahead. She had learned that over the years, watching him work cases, watching him tear criminals apart piece by piece. Now, she was his target. Her phone buzzed. Not the burner, her real phone. She glanced at the screen. A known number. Her pulse spiked. Slowly she picked it up. Hello. A low, smooth voice greeted her. Running out of options, aren't you? Her blood turned to ice. Dylan. She swallowed. Forced herself to stay calm. I don't know what you're talking about. Dylan chuckled. But there was no warmth in it. Only cold amusement. Oh, come on, Claire. You don't actually think you can outplay me, do you? His voice was so casual, it made her stomach churn. Tommy's gone. The FBI has your name all over his transactions. And me? He exhaled slowly. I'm just watching. Waiting. Claire gritted her teeth. Dylan, listen to me. This isn't what you think. It's exactly what I think. Her grip on the phone tightened. You're doing this to me because I hurt you. Silence. Then Dylan said, No, Claire. I'm doing this because you tried to kill me. She sucked in a sharp breath. Dylan chuckled again. You're out of moves. You should start thinking about your next one carefully. The line went dead. Claire tossed the phone across the car in frustration. She needed an escape. And fast. Dylan sat at his desk, phone still in hand. His heart wasn't racing. His mind was clear. Claire was spiraling. She thought she could still play the game, but the problem was, he had already won. He glanced at the screen in front of him. Live FBI surveillance feed. Claire had no idea that her bank accounts were frozen. That every single one of her transactions was flagged. That there was an FBI tail following her every move. She was boxed in whether she knew it or not. A knock on his office door. Riley stepped in, dropping a folder on the desk. It's official. We're issuing a warrant for her arrest. Dylan glanced at the folder but didn't open it. He didn't need to. Instead, he exhaled slowly and nodded. Good. Claire paced inside a small motel room on the outskirts of town. Her phone was useless. Her money? Gone. And Tommy? Nowhere to be found. She had never felt fear like this before. There was only one person left to turn to. Dylan. She hesitated before dialing his number. She half expected him not to pick up. But he did. Silence stretched between them. Finally Claire spoke. Dylan, please. No response. Her throat tightened. I know I messed up. I know what I did was wrong. But please, you don't have to do this. Dylan sighed, and for the first time she heard something new in his voice. Finality. I already did, Claire. She froze. What? A knock sounded at the motel door. Her stomach dropped. Outside, red and blue lights flashed through the window. Her pulse pounded. Claire Hayes, a voice boomed from outside. FBI. Open the door. Her world shattered. She pressed the phone against her ear, desperate. Dylan, please? But the line was already dead. And the only thing waiting for her now was karma. Claire was trapped. Tommy was on the run. Dylan was untouchable. But this wasn't the end. Because Dylan still had one last move to make. And in the next chapter, Tommy Hale's luck was about to run out. Tommy Hale sat alone in a dimly lit penthouse suite, his whiskey glass untouched. The city skyline stretched out in front of him, but he wasn't admiring the view. He was thinking. Calculating. Dylan Hayes had moved faster than expected. Claire was done. Arrested. A liability he no longer had to worry about. But Tommy wasn't foolish enough to believe he was safe. No, this wasn't just about business anymore. This was personal. He had underestimated Dylan. That was his mistake. The FBI agent wasn't just going after his money or his business. Dylan wanted to destroy him. And Tommy wasn't about to let that happen. A knock sounded at the door. 3 sharp taps. His signal. Tommy leaned back, nodding toward his bodyguard. The man checked the peephole, then opened the door. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. Vincent Moretti. One of the few people Tommy actually trusted. Moretti sat down across from him, placing a file on the table. We've got a problem. Tommy smirked. What else is new? Moretti slid the file toward him. Tommy opened it and froze. Inside were pages of FBI reports, leaked case files, confidential notes. All pointing to one thing. Dylan was still coming for him. Warrants were being drafted. Financial accounts were being seized. His business associates were being watched. And worst of all, one of his own men had flipped. Tommy clenched his jaw. Who? Moretti hesitated. Tommy's patience snapped. Who? Moretti exhaled. Marco. Tommy went still. Marco had been with him for years. A man he trusted. A man who knew everything. And now, he had betrayed him. Tommy's fingers drummed against the table as rage simmered beneath the surface. You know what to do, he said coldly. Moretti nodded once. Consider it handled. But even as he said the words, Tommy knew the truth. Dylan wasn't going to stop. And for the first time in his life, Tommy Hale felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Dylan knew Tommy would run. That was what men like him did when things got tough. But Dylan wasn't going to let that happen. He had spent the last week setting up the perfect trap. Using his connections, his skills, his experience. And now it was time to spring it. He sat alone in his car, watching the entrance of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was one of Tommy's last safe houses. Dylan knew that because he had made sure Tommy believed it was still safe. A few carefully placed leaks. A few well-timed anonymous tips. And now Tommy Hale was walking straight into a setup. A sleek black SUV pulled up. Tommy stepped out looking tense. His bodyguards flanked him on both sides as they approached the warehouse doors. Dylan's heartbeat was steady. Cold. Calculated. He stepped out of his car and walked toward them, hands in his pockets. Tommy saw him immediately. He stiffened, his hand hovering over his waistband, where a gun was hidden. Dylan smirked. Relax. If I wanted you dead, I wouldn't be standing here. Tommy exhaled sharply, eyeing him. You've been a busy man, Agent Hayes. Dylan tilted his head. And you've been a sloppy one. Tommy chuckled, but there was no humor in it. You really think you've won? Dylan just stared at him. I don't think, Tommy. I know. Silence stretched between them. Then Tommy lunged. It was fast, almost too fast. But Dylan was faster. He dodged, grabbing Tommy's arm, twisting it behind his back in a single fluid motion. The bodyguards reached for their weapons. But before they could move, red and blue lights flooded the area. FBI agents poured in, guns drawn. Tommy went rigid. Dylan leaned in, his breath cold against Tommy's ear. Checkmate. Tommy struggled, but it was useless. Dylan tightened his grip, shoving him toward the ground as agents surrounded them. Moretti, the one person Tommy thought he could trust, was being dragged out in handcuffs, along with half a dozen other men from his inner circle. Tommy's entire empire was crumbling. And Dylan was watching it burn. A sharp voice cut through the chaos. Agent Hayes. Dylan turned. Riley Carter stood there, his gun still drawn, watching everything unfold. Dylan nodded once. It's over. Riley smirked. Damn right it is. Tommy twisted his head, glaring up at Dylan. You think you're the good guy? He spat. You think this makes you better than me? Dylan crouched down, meeting his gaze. No, Tommy, he said softly. This just makes me the one who won. Tommy let out a bitter laugh. What about Claire? Dylan's expression hardened. She made her bed, he said simply. Now she gets to rot in it. Tommy shook his head. You think prison's worse than this? Than what you did to me? Dylan smirked. Prison? He echoed. Oh, Tommy, you're not going to prison. Tommy's face twisted in confusion. What the hell are you talking about? Dylan stood. You're not making it to trial. A chilling silence settled between them. And then, in the distance, the sound of gunfire. Dylan stepped back as one of the agents turned, shouting. Sniper. Tommy's eyes went wide. And in a single brutal moment, a shot rang out. Tommy collapsed. Blood pooled beneath him. His body jerked once, then went still. Dylan didn't react. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, watching as the life drained from Tommy Hale's eyes. One less problem in the world. And one step closer to closure. The chaos unfolded in slow motion. The moment the sniper's bullet struck, Tommy's body hit the ground with a sickening thud. His face twisted in shock, his mouth opening like he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Blood seeped into the concrete beneath him, spreading in dark tendrils. Dylan stood still, his hands in his pockets, watching. He didn't move to help. He didn't call for paramedics. He didn't care. Around him, agents scrambled into position. Riley barked orders. Secure the perimeter. We need to know where that shot came from. Dylan already knew. This wasn't FBI protocol. This wasn't a stray hit. This was a hit. Tommy had made too many enemies. The moment word spread that he was arrested, someone had taken matters into their own hands. Dylan exhaled, glancing down at Tommy's twitching fingers. His breath was ragged, his body trying to cling to life. But Dylan saw the truth in his fading eyes. It was over. Tommy Hale was dying. Dylan. Riley's voice was sharp. We need medics. Dylan shook his head. He's gone. And as if to confirm it, Tommy's body gave one final, shuddering exhale. Then stillness. No last words. No dramatic speech. Just emptiness. Riley muttered a curse, rubbing a hand over his face. Well, that's one way to close a case. Dylan turned away from Tommy's body, his jaw tight. There was no justice in this. No handcuffs. No trial. Tommy's punishment had come from the streets, not the law. And somehow, Dylan was completely fine with that. The courtroom was silent. Claire sat at the defense table, her back rigid, her hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles were white. Her hair, once perfectly styled, was limp. Her face was pale. She didn't look like the woman Dylan married. She looked beaten. And yet Dylan felt nothing. He sat in the back row watching as the judge flipped through the case files. Every piece of evidence stacked against Claire was laid out. Her financial records, her meetings with Tommy, her attempt to cover up his crimes. She had tried to run. She had tried to lie. And now, there was nowhere left to hide. The judge finally spoke. Claire Hayes, you are hereby sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and aiding and abetting criminal activity. Claire flinched. 15 years. It could have been more. It should have been more. But in the end it didn't matter. Because she had lost everything. Dylan leaned back in his seat as Claire slowly turned her head, her eyes locking onto his. There was no anger there. No hatred. No rage. Only desperation. As if she was silently begging him to undo this. But Dylan? He just stared back. Cold. Indifferent. She wasn't his problem anymore. And as the guards approached, locking Claire's wrists in handcuffs, he didn't feel a damn thing. The news spread like wildfire. Tommy Hale, dead. Claire Hayes, sentenced. Dylan watched the chaos unfold from the quiet of his apartment. Every major network ran the story. Reporters dissected Claire's betrayal, splashing her face across screens. The once perfect wife of an FBI agent turned criminal accomplice. How did she fall so far? Did she love Tommy Hale or was she just another pawn? And what about Dylan Hayes? His name came up often but he ignored it. He turned off the TV, poured himself a drink and stood by the window staring out at the city. For years this city had been his battleground. Now he was finally done. There was no more Tommy Hale. No more Claire. No more lies. He had won. And for the first time in years, he finally felt free. The courthouse hallways were empty, the kind of silence that felt thick and heavy. Dylan walked with a steady pace, a single manila envelope in his grip. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't second-guessing. This was just another case. Except this time, it wasn't about criminals or FBI investigations. It was about closing the last door to his past. Claire was already seated when he entered the small conference room. She looked different. Not just because of the bland prison uniform or the lack of expensive makeup. It was deeper than that. She looked hollow. Dylan sat across from her, placing the envelope on the table between them. Neither of them spoke at first. The air was thick with unfinished words, shattered memories, and choices that could never be undone. Claire finally broke the silence. You didn't have to come. Dylan studied her, his face unreadable. I wanted to watch you sign it. She flinched. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not love. Regret. I didn't think it would end like this, she whispered, her fingers grazing the papers but not picking them up. Dylan leaned back, his expression cold. How did you think it would end, Claire? She looked down at her hands, her voice barely audible. I don't know. Maybe not with you hating me. He let out a short laugh, one devoid of humor. I don't hate you. Her head snapped up, surprised. Dylan's smirk was almost amused. Almost. I just don't care anymore. The words landed like a slap. Claire's lips parted, but no words came. She had cheated. What? Betrayed. And now she wanted something from him. Some kind of validation that she still mattered. She didn't. Dylan pushed the pen toward her. Sign it. Claire hesitated for half a second before picking up the pen. Her hands were shaking. Whether it was from anger, sadness, or guilt, he didn't know. And he didn't care. She signed. And with one stroke of ink it was done. The last tie to her was severed. Dylan stood, grabbing the envelope. He didn't say goodbye. Didn't offer a final word. He just walked out. Because this part of his life was over. Prison wasn't kind to men like Tommy Hale. By the time word spread that he had been locked up, it wasn't just law enforcement watching him, it was every criminal he had ever screwed over. And there were a lot of them. Inside the cold, gray walls of a maximum security facility, Tommy sat alone in the corner of the cafeteria, pretending to read a book. His usual confidence was gone, his cocky smirk replaced by something else. Paranoia. He had enemies everywhere. Some from the cartel. Some from his own former associates. Tommy knew the rules. You don't survive in a place like this by looking weak. But it didn't matter. Because the moment the prison doors shut behind him, his fate had already been sealed. One evening when the guards did their rounds, Tommy was found in his cell. Not sleeping. Not breathing. The official report said suicide. But everyone knew the truth. Tommy Hale didn't kill himself. Someone made sure he never left that prison alive. And when the news reached Dylan, he simply poured himself a drink and stared out at the city. No reaction. No satisfaction. Just the quiet knowledge that karma had done its job. One less problem in the world. One less enemy breathing. And Dylan? He was still standing. Dylan had only ever returned to the prison once. Not for Tommy. For her. It was a month after the divorce was finalized when he received the letter. Claire wanted to see him. He didn't owe her anything. But curiosity won. And now he was here. The visiting room was bleak. Claire sat across the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She looked at him like she was searching for something, some trace of the man who once loved her. She wouldn't find it. You came, she said softly. Dylan exhaled, leaning back in his chair. Say what you need to say. She swallowed, nodding. I wanted to apologize. Dylan didn't flinch. Didn't react. He just waited. Claire let out a shaky breath. I know you'll never forgive me. And I don't expect you to. But I needed you to hear me say it. Silence. Then Dylan spoke. Is that it? She blinked as if she had expected something more. Maybe some small part of her had hoped for a different ending. But this was reality. And in this reality, Dylan Hayes had already moved on. He stood, grabbing his coat. Claire's eyes widened. That's it. Dylan paused. Looked at her one last time. I don't hate you, Claire, he said, his voice calm. I just don't care anymore. And with that, he walked away. This time for good. Dylan never looked back. Not once. He left the prison that day and drove through the city, the weight of the past slowly unraveling from his chest. The streets felt different. Not new, not exciting, just free. For the first time in years, there was no case looming over his head. No lies tangled in his life. No Claire. No Tommy. Just silence. And Dylan found that he liked it. He didn't rush back to work. The FBI had offered him a promotion, something that once would have fueled his ambition. But now he needed time. He took leave, packed a bag, and drove south. No destination. No agenda. Just miles of open road and the feeling of being untethered for the first time in a long time. Somewhere along the way he found a quiet coastal town. He rented a small place near the water, spent his mornings drinking coffee on the balcony, and let the sound of the waves drown out the ghosts of his past. It wasn't a new life. It was just a moment to breathe. One evening as he walked along the pier, a woman sat on a bench reading a book. She wasn't breathtakingly beautiful. She wasn't dressed to impress. She was just real. And when she glanced up and smiled at him, Dylan realized something. He wasn't broken anymore. He wasn't searching for revenge or closure. He was just living. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Prison wasn't what Claire had expected. It wasn't about the cold food or the rough beds. It wasn't even about the fights that broke out in the yard. It was about being forgotten. No one wrote to her. No one visited. The world moved on and she didn't exist in it anymore. She had spent years crafting her perfect life, only to see it shatter overnight. But there was one person left. One person who might still care. Dylan. She sat in her tiny cell, pen in hand, writing her last hope. Dylan. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know you have every reason to hate me. But I need you to hear this. I never meant to destroy us. I never meant for it to get this far. I was weak. I was selfish. And I will regret it every day for the rest of my life. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. And losing you is worse than any prison sentence. I just need to know if there's even the smallest part of you that still remembers the good. Claire. She folded the letter, sealing it. The guards took it, promising it would be mailed. And then, she waited. Days passed. Then weeks. But no response came. Because Dylan never read it. He never even opened it. He just saw her name on the envelope, and tossed it in the fire. Dylan had learned something about pain. It doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. For months he had let anger and revenge fuel him. He had let it consume him, make him into a version of himself that he barely recognized. But now he knew that he had won. Not because Tommy was dead. Not because Claire was locked away. But because he had walked away. He started working again, but this time, it wasn't about ambition or proving anything. It was just a job. Something to fill the time between the things that actually mattered. He surfed in the mornings, met new people, allowed himself to live. And then there was her. The woman from the pier. Her name was Hannah. She wasn't perfect. She had her own past, her own wounds. But she was real. She didn't play games. She didn't hide behind lies. And when Dylan kissed her for the first time, he realized something. It didn't feel like forgetting. Felt like starting over. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Claire had once believed that time would soften her punishment. That the world would eventually forget. But time had only made things worse. Prison had stripped her of everything. Her beauty, her charm, her carefully crafted image. She was no longer Claire Hayes, the elegant wife of an FBI agent. She was just another forgotten inmate. She kept waiting for the day someone, anyone, would reach out. A letter, a visit. Dylan. But no one came. One day in the crowded cafeteria, she sat alone, keeping her head down. She had learned how to survive. How to avoid trouble. But trouble had a way of finding her. A tray slammed onto the table across from her. Claire looked up into the eyes of a woman covered in tattoos, her face lined with scars. A woman who had nothing to lose. You think you're special? The woman sneered. You think you don't belong here? Claire didn't respond. You were married to an FBI agent, weren't you? The woman leaned closer, voice dropping. Bet he's got himself a new girl by now. Claire's chest tightened. She had told herself Dylan was suffering without her. That he still thought about her. But the truth? He had moved on. Claire hadn't just lost her freedom. She had lost everything. And in that moment she realized something chilling. This was karma. Not just the bars, the sentence, the isolation. The knowing. The knowing that out there in the real world Dylan was happy. And she would rot in a place where no one remembered her name. Dylan sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It had been a long road, from the moment he first suspected Claire, to the moment he let her go. Now it was all in the past. Tommy was gone. Claire was paying for her choices. The pain, the anger, the betrayal, all of it had faded. He had won. But it didn't feel like a victory. It just felt like life. Hannah stepped out, handing him a beer. She leaned against the railing, watching him with quiet curiosity. You're thinking about them again, aren't you? Dylan exhaled, taking a slow sip. Not in the way you think. Hannah smirked. Not in a revenge way? Dylan chuckled. No. That part's over. She sat beside him, tucking her legs under her. So what then? Dylan stared at the sky, searching for the words. Just how different things could have been. How much time I wasted trying to fix something that was already broken. Hannah was silent for a moment before she reached over and squeezed his hand. Maybe you had to go through it, she said softly. To get here. Dylan glanced at her, taking in the warmth of her gaze. Maybe she was right. Maybe karma had worked both ways. Because Claire was trapped in the hell she created. And Dylan? Dylan was finally free. Dylan never thought he'd be the kind of man to walk away from the life he built, but as he stood in front of the FBI headquarters one last time, he felt nothing but relief. The bureau had been his entire life, his career, his purpose. But after everything, Claire's betrayal, Tommy's downfall, the war he fought and won, he realized something. He didn't need this job to be who he was. He had proven his point. So, when the director offered him a promotion, a desk job in Washington, a cushy position where he'd never have to chase criminals again, he turned it down. "You're sure about this?" Riley Carter asked as they walked out together. Dylan nodded, slipping his badge onto the table. "Yeah. It's time." Riley smirked. "Retirement at your age? What the hell are you going to do with yourself?" Dylan shrugged. "Live." The truth was, for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was chasing something. Revenge. Justice. Closure. He had gotten all of it, and now he just wanted peace. He walked out of the building, breathing in the crisp morning air. No badge, no gun, no weight of the past pressing down on his shoulders. He had been chasing ghosts for too long. Now he was finally free. Claire had spent months rotting in her cell. Every day she told herself it wasn't over, that she could appeal, fight, that she could convince Dylan to help her. Because Dylan wasn't heartless. She knew him better than anyone. There had to be something left of the man who once loved her. So she made one last desperate attempt. She wrote to the FBI. She pleaded for one final meeting. And shockingly, they granted it. Claire sat in the cold, sterile visitation room, her hands trembling as the door opened. But when she saw who walked in, her heart sank. It wasn't Dylan. It was Riley Carter. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her expression blank. "Where's Dylan?" Riley sat across from her, tossing a file onto the table. "He's done, Claire. He doesn't care what happens to you." Claire's stomach twisted. "That's not true." Riley leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "You destroyed him. You think he's going to come running to save you?" Her vision blurred. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to convince him. Appeal to the love they once had. But that love? It was dead. Just like her future. Riley stood, straightening his jacket. "Dylan asked me to give you a message." Claire froze. Riley smirked. "He said to tell you, he doesn't even remember your name." And then he walked out, leaving Claire with nothing. Dylan never thought about Claire anymore. Not in the way he used to. Not with anger or sadness or regret. She was just a part of his past. And now, he was done looking back. He stood on the edge of a cliffside road, the ocean stretching out before him. The sun was setting, casting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Hannah stood beside him, watching him carefully. "You okay?" Dylan exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, I am." And for the first time, he meant it. He pulled a small envelope from his jacket. The last thing tying him to the past. Claire's final letter. He had carried it for weeks. Not because he wanted to read it, but because part of him needed to let it go the right way. Without hesitation, he flicked his wrist, sending the envelope sailing into the wind. It spun through the air, caught in the breeze, before landing in the waves below. Gone. No more ghosts. No more memories. Just the sound of the waves, the warmth of the sun, and the quiet certainty that he had won. Hannah slipped her hand into his. He squeezed it, meeting her gaze. "What now?" she asked softly. Dylan smirked. "Now, we start over." And with that, he walked away, toward a future that was finally his own. Dylan had spent most of his life living in a world of shadows and deception. A world where he had to be 3 steps ahead, where trust was a liability, and where love had proven to be his greatest weakness. But now, for the first time in years, he was stepping into something unknown. Something real. The ocean breeze ruffled his shirt as he sat on the porch of his new home. Not a penthouse, not an apartment in the heart of the city, but a quiet house on the coast. A place where no one knew him as Agent Hayes. No one whispered his name in hushed conversations about the biggest takedown of the decade. Here he was, just Dylan. Hannah stepped outside, barefoot, holding 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one, sitting beside him on the wooden railing. "You look like a man who doesn't know what to do with himself." Dylan smirked, taking a sip. "Maybe I don't." She tilted her head. "What do you miss the most?" He thought about it. The adrenaline of chasing criminals? The satisfaction of closing a case? No, he didn't miss the weight of it. "I don't miss anything," he admitted, surprising even himself. "For the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I'm chasing something." Hannah smiled, nudging his shoulder. "Good. That means you're exactly where you need to be." Dylan exhaled slowly, staring out at the horizon. Maybe she was right. For so long revenge had consumed him. He had breathed it, lived it, let it fuel him. But now he was just living. Claire had nothing left but time. Time to think. Time to wonder how everything had gone so horribly wrong. She sat on the thin, scratchy cot in her prison cell, staring at the ceiling. 15 years. Sounded like a lifetime. Because it was. The woman she had been, the wife of a respected FBI agent, the charming socialite, the woman who could talk her way out of anything, was gone. Now she was just prisoner number 48219. She had tried everything to fix this. To undo the damage. The plea deals, the letters, the attempts to reach Dylan. But nothing worked. No one cared. And the worst part? Dylan wasn't suffering. She had told herself, lied to herself, that even though she had lost everything, at least she had left a scar on him. But the last report she got from her lawyer told her the truth. Dylan had moved on. He had quit the FBI. He had disappeared. He was free. And Claire? Claire was rotting in a cage. She clenched her fists, her breath shaky. This wasn't fair. She had been his wife. Didn't that mean something? Didn't she still matter? The guard knocked on the bars, breaking her spiraling thoughts. You got mail, Hayes. Claire's heart jumped. Was it Dylan? Had he finally? A plain envelope slid through the slot. She grabbed it quickly, tearing it open. But her breath hitched when she saw who it was from. Tommy Hale's sister. Her hands shook as she read the letter. Claire. I hope you're sleeping well at night because my brother isn't. He's 6 feet under because of you. I don't care how long your sentence is. I don't care if you rot in that cell for the rest of your life. But don't think for a second that you've paid for what you did. Because you haven't. Not yet. And trust me, sweetheart, you will. Claire's stomach dropped. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She had made too many enemies. And even behind bars? She wasn't safe. Dylan's phone buzzed as he sat on the dock, watching the waves roll against the shore. He debated ignoring it. But old habits died hard. He pulled the phone from his pocket, glancing at the screen. Unknown number. Frowning, he answered. Yeah. Pause. Then a familiar voice. Hayes. Dylan's grip on the phone tightened. It was an old contact from the FBI, someone who still owed him favors. You're out of the game, the man continued, but I thought you should know, Claire might not make it to the end of her sentence. Dylan's blood went cold. What? She's got enemies in there. People connected to Tommy. They don't care that she's already paying for what she did. Dylan exhaled slowly, his jaw clenching. So why tell me? Another pause. Then. Because part of me thinks you might still give a damn. Dylan stared out at the water, his pulse steady. Did he care? He wasn't sure. Claire had made her choices. She had picked her side. She had tried to destroy him. And now karma was coming for her. Dylan wasn't a savior. Not anymore. Keep me updated, he said before ending the call. Then, without hesitation, he tossed the phone into the ocean. It sank beneath the waves, disappearing forever. Just like Claire. Dylan sat at a small cafe, a fresh cup of coffee in front of him, the scent of the ocean drifting through the open windows. It had been months since he left the FBI, months since he had let go of the ghosts of his past. And yet, as he sipped his coffee, he realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for the next hit. For the next betrayal. For the next war. He had won. And now he was just living. Hannah sat across from him, stirring sugar into her coffee. She didn't press him for details about his past. She never asked about Claire or Tommy or the years of blood and deception. She only asked about the present. And Dylan liked that. You're quiet today, she said, eyeing him over her cup. Dylan smirked. That's not new. Hannah tilted her head. No. But this quiet feels different. He exhaled, setting his cup down. Maybe it is. For so long, silence had been suffocating. Now it felt like freedom. They sat in comfortable quiet, watching the waves in the distance. Then Hannah reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. Whatever you're thinking about, she murmured, you don't have to carry it anymore. Dylan met her gaze, searching for any trace of lies, any sign of betrayal. There were none. Because this was real. And maybe that was enough. Claire Hayes had once believed that she could survive anything. She had survived Dylan's betrayal. She had survived Tommy's downfall. She had survived prison. But karma? Karma had a way of creeping up when you least expected it. The letter from Tommy's sister had been the first warning. The second came a week later. Claire had been careful in prison. She had learned the rules. She stayed quiet, avoided fights, never picked sides. But it didn't matter. Because in a place like this, you didn't have to make enemies. They found you anyway. One night, as she returned to her cell after dinner, she felt it, a presence behind her. Too close. She turned, but it was too late. A sharp pain exploded in her side. A cold, metallic sting. A blade. Her body collapsed before she even registered the attack. She gasped, pressing a shaking hand against the wound. Warm, sticky blood spilled through her fingers. Above her, a pair of dark eyes stared down. A voice she barely recognized whispered, "This is for Tommy." And then footsteps. Fading. Gone. Claire tried to scream, but her voice was weak. The world around her blurred. And for the first time she truly understood what Dylan must have felt. Betrayed. Alone. Powerless. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the cold prison ceiling above her. The final punishment. The ultimate karma. Dylan stood on the pier, watching the sun dip into the horizon. He hadn't checked his phone in days. Hadn't turned on the news. He didn't need to. Claire's fate was already sealed. He didn't need confirmation. Didn't need closure. He had let go of her a long time ago. But as he stared at the waves, he wondered, had she learned? Had she, in those last moments, finally understood that every action had consequences? That betrayal always came back tenfold? Maybe. Or maybe it didn't matter. Because the past? It wasn't his burden anymore. Hannah stepped beside him, slipping her arm through his. "You ready?" she asked softly. Dylan exhaled. Yeah. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't need to. Because Claire was gone. And Dylan? He was still here. And he was finally free. The ocean stretched endlessly before him, waves rolling in steady, rhythmic patterns. The air was crisp, tinged with the salty scent of the sea. Dylan stood on the shore, hands in his pockets, watching the tide pull in and out, just as life had done to him. It had taken everything from him. His marriage. His trust. His illusions of love and loyalty. And yet, in return, it had given him something far more valuable. Freedom. For the first time in years, there was no enemy waiting in the shadows. No betrayal lurking beneath whispered words. No anger burning in his chest. Claire was gone. News of her prison attack had reached him weeks ago, but he hadn't reacted. No satisfaction, no sympathy. Just a quiet acceptance that karma had finished what he started. She had made her choices. And in the end, she had paid the price. The world had moved on, and so had Dylan. Hannah stepped beside him, slipping her arm through his. Her warmth was different. It wasn't something he had to chase, wasn't something wrapped in deception or manipulation. It was steady. Constant. Real. "Where do we go from here?" she asked softly. Dylan exhaled, letting the wind carry away the last fragments of his past. "Wherever the hell we want." A slow smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "I like the sound of that." Dylan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small coin, a relic from his past life. The kind of thing he once held onto as if it mattered. Without hesitation he tossed it into the ocean. No more ghosts. No more unfinished business. Just him. Living. Moving forward. Finally at peace. And now, one last thing for you. That's it. That's the end. The final page of Dylan's story, the story of betrayal, revenge, and ultimately freedom. But before you go, I want to hear from you. If you were in Dylan's shoes, would you have forgiven Claire, or let karma take its course? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you loved this journey, if you stayed with Dylan from the very first chapter to the final moment, show some love. Like this. Share it. Subscribe. Because stories like these, they don't just end. They stay with you. And trust me, the next one is coming soon.